Hi, John.
Good morning.
How's it hanging?
Pretty good. Pretty good.
Happy Friday. Happy Friday, everybody.
Really? Shall I plunge in?
Plunge in, John.
I think that we're maybe still rounding up people, but just because we have an abbreviated amount of time compared to yesterday, this panel is originally, Liz and Purvi asked me to see if I could put together a panel to have a discussion of the Voluntary Voting Systems Guidelines, the VVSG. And I said, well, gee, why don't we discuss election standards in general? And to make it worse, why don't we also discuss certification? Because, you need to certify to these standards. So they were very enthusiastic about that, and we rounded up I think you'll find an excellent group of people to discuss these issues. John Wack, on the end down here, has been a voting researcher and developer since 2003. Before that, he worked on internet security. Besides developing requirements for the next VVSG, his current focus is on completion of a whole series of common data formats for election devices. Our next, and John is going to try in 10 minutes to give you an overview of the VVSG, the common data formats, and other federal standards for election systems and data. And it's been my real pleasure to have been working with John on this for quite a while. I remember that when I first came to verified voting in 2004, one of the initial things they asked me to do is comment on the VVSG 1.0 draft. And send in quite a lengthy diatribe about that. Our next speaker, Sindhu Ramachandran, works as a voting systems analyst with the Pennsylvania Department of State, where she manages the voting system and certification program. She joined the department just recently in April of 2017. But prior to that, she worked in private industry in several technical and leadership roles, particularly for healthcare payer organizations, designing, developing, and implementing. Finally, Joe Canary, we can't miss Joe because of yesterday's amazing announcement, has been causing excitement in elections since 2003. He's been a professor at several universities and helped start and run several technology companies in areas ranging from computer gaming to chip design. These days, he's a principal scientist at Galois and the principled CEO and chief scientist at Free and Fair. So I'm going to turn it over to John to lead us off. We're trying to keep things short so that we can have plenty of questions and interaction.
Send this.
I love hearing my name out loud pronounced correctly.
You made it possible. Well, is that it?
Uh-oh. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to John for organizing the panel. It's a privilege to be here. I looked at the main page of the website the other day and noticed that I'm even on a picture there. I was really impressed with that, with Ron Rivest, who I worked with in the standards. I showed it to my wife, And, I said, what do you think of this? She, said, I'm right next to Ron Rivest. He's the R of RSA. And she says, I really think that sport coat makes you look bad. And it's not the right color at all. That may explain why I'm wearing yesterday's sport coat today. So I want to talk about the common data format work, but I think I would like to weave it into what's going on with the VVSG. And since you may not be aware of all things, I'll just do this very briefly. So the EAC, when it was formed, runs the testing and certification program. So the VVSG is a set of requirements for voting systems and how voting systems are tested. And they were originally written, that John commented on, very quickly. HAVA mandated that the first set of guidelines be written in something like 6 months, and effectively it was like 4 months, which is a ridiculously short amount of time. So what resulted was pretty much the existing 1992 and I think 2002 VSS voluntary voting system software standards, something like that. There were improvements in security and in human factors. The TGDC made a decision to come out with a brand new standard, which was going to be called VVSG 2.0. And that took 2 years. That was a lot of work. Ron worked very, very heavily on that. And a previous set of EAC commissioners decided not to adopt it in 2008. Parts of it were transferred over to VVSG 1.0, which resulted in VVSG 1.1. So that is the most recent standard, but no one is building to it. And I think the main reason is because vendors have been expecting a major upgrade in the standards, and they don't want to commit resources till that comes out. So the new version coming out is now being called 2.0. It consists of the principles and guidelines, which are out for public review. And the principles and guidelines are designed to be high-level requirements that just aren't going to change. Everybody can agree to them. They're what voting systems should do. And the idea is that since the VVSG have to be voted on by the commissioners, which can take a lengthy amount of time to get to, and as you know, there have been long periods where there haven't been a quorum of commissioners. The idea is separate the more detailed requirements from the VVSG, put them elsewhere, and have them vote on the principles and guidelines. So we can have updates to the requirements much more easily than if they are set in the VVSG. Several people have asked me, okay, well, what's the process for voting on the requirements and reviewing those? And I don't think the EAC has announced that yet, so I really don't know the answer to that. But there should be, obviously, some process involved in that. And it looks as if there will be a TGDC meeting possibly in the June timeframe, and I think that will be probably, on the table there for discussion. The VVSG and the testing and certification program is set up to test an entire voting system, which is the basic set of devices to run an election. And, not all devices. Electronic poll books are out of scope. And when Eddie Perez talked yesterday, he talked about how, in his opinion, that has become very unwieldy, very cumbersome, and it's not something that's going to work when it comes to securing systems. So he would like some changes, and the EAC for a while and NIST have been thinking along those lines, and the common data formats, that project, well, it was considered a long time ago, actually, in the early 2000s for the first VVSG, but it's a big project and it takes a long time, and there just wasn't time to fit it in. So in the 2007 version that did not get approved by the TGDC, we used a word called integratability as opposed to interoperability. So it ought to be easy to integrate devices with each other. And one way of doing that is having a common data format and hardware interfaces that are, what's used in industry. And the ability to put COTS into the voting system. So that is happening now somewhat. And I don't really need to go too much into the slides other than to show you that we've got 5 specifications which are essentially done. They're waiting for some internal reviews, but those aren't a problem. Let's see if I can figure out how to move to, okay, status, what and why. Essentially, a common data format is simply a well thought out structure for election data so that you can transmit it from one device to another. And one of the reasons why it takes a long time is because if you want true interoperability, you want to do it well from the first get-go. The other thing is that you have to start thinking about the data itself. If one of the data elements is a ballot, well, what is the definition of a ballot? What are you going to decide that to be? Or a cast ballot, an indication that a ballot is cast. What does that really mean? So you have to go through this process of figuring all that out. And you eventually, after 10 years, get to the point where you have some specifications ready. So the status in a nutshell, most are done. We have a glossary that we have, if you've been in the public working groups, you've heard about it. And the principles and guidelines, I think, do not have any words in them that say that the testing and certification program has to continue testing only voting systems. There is one principle on interoperability, and looking through the language, it doesn't say anything about the certification programming, not allowing component certification. So I think this could be a possibility. This would have to be discussed more with the EAC. There are some issues with doing that. I think obviously some of the vendors aren't happy about that because it breaks up their model. It's been pointed out to me that election officials aren't necessarily happy about having to deal with multiple vendors at the same time. Somebody pointed out that in an ideal world, vendors might more be integrators of different equipment. But the wonderful idea would be that an election official has a certain population they have to serve, and they decide that a certain accessible system is what they want. They could buy it. They could integrate it into their voting system. It wouldn't be a lengthy process. Voters would be better served. I guess I'll wrap up, and there's more to say, but things are proceeding in that direction, and I'm hopeful we'll get to that goal of device certification. The slides here, if you have a lot of trouble sleeping tonight, you can go read through the rest of them on the individual specifications. I'd be happy to talk to you about them, privately or after the talk. So, thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you all for inviting me, and I'm here to talk about state-specific voting system testing and certification, and I'll be talking about Pennsylvania. And before I start off, I just want to do a few quick thank you notes personally and to people who have contributed to this effort in Pennsylvania. I want to start by thanking Mary Ann Schneider for guiding me through this process while she was at the Department of State. I also want to thank Whitney Kissenberry and her entire CCD team for helping us craft the accessibility testing and guiding us through the process. Thank you to the entire ESC testing and certification team for their collaborations and support. And I also want to thank our examiners and the VSTLs for helping us make this happen. So since that's done, I'll get moving to the slides. So I'll just start off by telling what voting system testing standards are in general. So it depends. The standards actually vary from state to state. Some states just adopt federal standards, and some states like California develop their own standards, and some states use a hybrid approach where they use the federal testing as a baseline to start their testing and then do additional state-specific testing. The way the testing's done is also different between state to state. Some states collaborate with universities. Some states do in-house testing, whereas some states have consultant examiners doing their testing. I won't get into too much detail there. I just compiled a few good links where you can go and find. The first is an ESC link that provides a map and tells you about what each state follows, and the next is an NCSL research compilation. So now coming to Pennsylvania, right? What Pennsylvania election code tells about voting systems is that every voting system used in the state must be examined and certified by the secretary. And the election code also requires that the voting system must meet federal standard. So that being said, Pennsylvania always used the hybrid approach where state-specific testing was done after federal testing. And again, just to put some background or some perspective to all this, right? This is the current voting system landscape in Pennsylvania. Out of the 67 counties, 50 counties still use DREs, and we have 17 counties who use optical scans. We are on our way to modernization, and we're making great progress there, and this is as of 10/31/2018. So I want to bring to your attention some important events in the modernization efforts that has direct impact to the voting system certification. So on September 11, 2017, we actually changed the fee structure for voting system examination. So till then, we used to get a fixed deposit of $3,000 for each system being examined. And with the change, what we did was that we made the vendor responsible for the entire cost of the examination. And on February 9, 2018, the department published a directive that suggested that all Commonwealth voting systems purchased from that day onwards must be resilient and must employ a voter verifiable paper record. And on April 12, 2018, the department actually told counties that everybody has to upgrade to newer resilient systems by the end of 2019, and they have to pick systems that have been certified by the secretary as of January 1st, on or after January 1st, 2018. So when this happened, we just had one system that was certified after January 1st, 2018. So we knew that we had a huge task ahead of us, but at the same time, we wanted to make sure that our certification process is efficient and robust. And moving on, right, I think I'll talk about the examination and certification process in a little detail. We always have had progressions in that field. So again, just to give some background, prior to 2012, it was quite open-ended, where the examiner came in and tested the system for election code compliance and gave us a report. And between 2012 and 2015, there was some effort to make it more structured, where the department actually requested the examiner that they should provide test suites before the examination, and we reviewed the test suites, and they were all published on the website for public viewing before the examination. And then between 2015 and 2017, when everybody realized the need for additional security and accessibility testing, we tried to incorporate some open-ended accessibility and security testing. It was really open-ended and differed between systems. So sometimes we would just do a source code review. Sometimes we would have some in-house expert review the system, or sometimes we would even collaborate with other states who has done accessibility testing and security testing and work with them to get their insights. So moving on, let's see what happens today, right? So again, this is my way of putting parts to the examination. So I'll tell that today's certification examination in Pennsylvania has 3 sections. One is the functional examination, and then the next is the security testing, and then the next is the accessibility examination. So I'll go into brief detail to each of these. And functional examination changes, right? So no discussion about Pennsylvania voting systems is complete without discussing about the straight party method. That's quite unique. And the history was that, like, most often systems would be brought in for certification and they would fail on that election code requirement. We wanted to avoid that from happening, especially because we wanted to have systems certified as quickly as possible. So what we did there was that we created an elaborate test case, or we created elaborate scenarios to test Pennsylvania straight party method and shared it with vendors and examiners. We also reached out to ESE, and with their help and support, we sent the directive out to the voting system test lab so that they can incorporate the testing as part of their federal testing, so that we won't have the problem of systems failing once they come for Pennsylvania state examination. And we also did some additional standardization. We made the testing more elaborate. We picked specific contests and ballots from previous election years that's of important to us. We created elaborate voting variations to make sure that every ballot position is tested, every write-in position is tested. And we also started doing a limited source code review prior to the functional examination to make sure that the examiner can test for any specific items as part of the functional examination. Moving on, let's talk about the security and accessibility testing, right? Before we walk into the testing, we wanted to make sure that we have a guidance as to what we should test for, or in other words, we can say standard. So what we considered when creating the standard. So the first thing that came into mind was that the federal standards were adopted as of 2005 and was sunset in 2017. And as John mentioned, we are still certifying systems to VVSG 1.0. So we have to make sure that we enhance the testing from that aspect. And we also wanted to make sure that VVSG is considered a technical standard, so it is focused on the qualities of the system rather than the system in use. But from a state perspective, the system in use and the processes around it is absolutely of utmost importance. We wanted to be able to tell the jurisdictions exactly how they can implement the systems in such a way that it is implemented effectively and securely. So that's about what we should have in the standard. And I think I just want to take a minute to talk about some of the attributes that we thought about standards, right? I don't want to spend a lot of time there, but I want to talk about the need for it to be realistic and the need for it to be timely. So we wanted it to be realistic because we wanted to be able to certify systems, and we know that only a finite number of systems go through the federal certification. And the election code requires that we have to have federally certified systems. So we wanted to make sure that we come up with a realistic standard that can be, that would allow us to pick systems from the pool of federally certified systems and certify in the state. And we also wanted to make sure that we have the standards created timely so that we can use it for the examinations immediately. I'm going to go a little bit fast. because I think I just have 2 minutes. So I'll go into a little bit detail about the security testing. The security testing actually was divided into 2 separate sections. One is a conformance testing and one is a penetration testing. And the conformance testing has requirements listed that can be categorized into these 6 sections. And I want to talk about the penetration testing a little. There, we had to be a little bit practical when we created the standard. We didn't want to end up in a situation where we had systems being tested forever and never came out of testing. So we put some parameters around it. We put some fixed duration, and we also identified some deliverables while the system goes through it so that we can track it. Moving on to the accessibility testing, there too, the philosophy was the same. We wanted to make sure that we understand the usability of the system for voters with disabilities. And we also wanted to make sure that we get the guidance on ways to use the system more effectively in polling places. So again, each of these are discussions in itself, so I'll just be very brief. So what's included in the accessibility testing? There is an expert review by examiners, and the qualifications of examiners there is quite unique. We make sure that we have an accessibility expert, a usability expert, and an election expert in the team of expert review. And the first thing that happens is they review the system and look at all the accessible options and then come up with items that they should check when the next steps of the testing happens. And the step 2 is we'd have voters with disabilities come and use the system, voting a reasonable length Pennsylvania specific ballot. And the ballot and the voting variations are actually chosen by the examiner, and they are all carefully chosen to make sure that we study specific user interactions with the system. The next step is we have election officials and poll workers come and test the setup of system and give their opinion. And I think that we have heard that a lot of times, even here yesterday, like people went to the polling place and then they knew that they had an option to vote independently and privately, but the poll worker told that, oh, I don't know how to set it up, so what do we do? So we wanted to make sure that we don't end up in that situation with the newer standard. So that, I think, concludes a brief overview of everything, and I think I'd say that that's a humble attempt from our side to make sure that every Pennsylvania eligible voter would be able to mark, verify, and cast their ballot independently and privately. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody.
Hello again.
Yes, hello again. So I got asked to sit on this panel some weeks ago before anyone knew about anything. And so I had to reflect upon what I was going to say now. So I have a couple of reflections that relate to both our long-term work on matters relating to these kinds of standards, as well as our direct work on the VVSG, and in matters of certification and open common data formats for other domains. So first, as a preface, the DARPA project that we're working on, insofar as it happens to demonstrate a voting system, will use the common data formats. And so for those pieces of the system that intersect with the formats, it'll just be a natural thing to do. And so there'll be some more open source code that'll support said formats. DARPA understands that that's an important thing with regards to the demonstration, and they don't mind we do it. And in part, that's because anytime we build a system for a government agency or working with a military contractor, we're obligated to do that anyway. In general, we're always asked, and we always think it's a great idea, to use open data formats in all of our work. It helps with regards to how you build the system, how you understand the system, how you can do interoperability, and how you can do component-based certification, which is the normal way we do things in the rest of the agency's work we do. So That being said, the government attitude about these kinds of things in these other agencies, I hope, informs what goes on as VVSG moves forward. In general, as we work with the DoD and the intelligence community, the systems we build have to not only conform to things like open standards and be open source, but have a very clear story about how you relate the system you build to the requirements you come from. And there's very good ways of doing that in the modern age, which we hope to see concretized in the detailed requirements that shake out from VVSG2. Now, I have to admit, my interactions with folks when I dip in and out of various VVSG2 working groups has been a little frustrating, because oftentimes the scientists in the room, and I include myself in that bag, say things like, well, this is how the world works when we develop systems in the normal world for the last 20 years, and the vendors say, no, it doesn't. And we end up in a little fight, and I'm constantly worried that standards will get watered down, both with regards to interoperability as well as cybersecurity as we move forward. So my hope is, despite the fact that some of us may be a little bit demoralized by the herky-jerky nature of VVSG2 and the fact that we didn't have commissioners for a while, we'll get reinvigorated to be involved and to fight the good fight and to make decisions based upon evidence. The other certification schemes that we interact with, I should say, which primarily have to do with nationally critical infrastructure and other areas and things that are deployed in the Department of Defense, are of a very different nature than what we're seeing here. And the interesting thing about it is, if you build a system that's meant to be deployed in the field, you might have a much higher bar to jump over, but it still takes about the same amount of time and resources as it is to jump over the bar that is VVSG 1.0, which I consider very close to the ground and I can step over it. So I'm hopeful that new standards will raise that bar considerably, yet if we move into the 21st century when it comes to software and systems engineering, the timeline, the cost, and the burden on vendors, which I realize is significant, will not grow tremendously, and we will have better systems. Now, overall, our planned contributions to this are to become, re-involved in the key working groups relevant to our areas of expertise, primarily the cybersecurity working group, and to work on our system such that it does conform to standards and can lift everyone's boats. My hope is that the existing vendors will be enthusiastic about reusing expertise of others as we move forward. Now, I should mention here, I say the other vendors and the like, we have no interest in being a vendor. I have no interest in selling voting machines whatsoever. We tried for a while to write some responses to RFPs, and it's a very interesting universe, as it were, and interesting things happen, and so I don't feel like doing that anymore. I enjoy what I'm doing now. But we do want to continue to do public good, and so my hope is that when it comes time to refine the top-level principles, most of which I like very much, into more detailed requirements, we can inject more 21st century thinking into them so that they evolve in a rational way and they can leverage modern technology to make all our voting systems more accessible and secure and transparent moving forward. And I'm happy to take questions in details.
Okay, thank you.
So before I open this up generally, I'd like to just pose a couple of questions for the panelists, myself. I guess I would say, I would ask you, if you've gotten a chance to look at these things, what parts of the VVSG seem to be controversial, and what can we do to encourage, as Joe has put it, sort of moving towards more modern ways of doing specification and certification. And maybe start with John.
Let's see, that's going to be tough to, part two of your question is a little tougher, but Gemma is my colleague from NIST, Gemma, who many of you know who participated in the cybersecurity working group. If you get a chance to talk with her, she can talk better to the security-related areas. I know two big areas are, will wireless be allowed in certain circumstances? And another one that's been discussed a lot is the use of barcodes. Will barcodes be permitted? There are others. In the area that I've been working on mainly, the larger manufacturers are okay with common data formats being an optional item, but they don't want them required. I have written requirements to require them. And so my understanding is that at one of the TGDC meetings, or the next big public one, whenever that is, those sorts of items will be discussed more, and the TGDC may take a position on it. And so the other part of your question, which is how can things evolve better to Joe's liking, but also to in my opinion, to work more efficiently, to allow more vendors into the marketplace, to go after component certification, to make things more nimble, to be able to respond to issues more quickly. One of the things that we are doing is to take a look at requirements that we've started with the 2007 document, the one that did not get approved, and we continued to update that as VVSG 1.1 was being developed, and there were public comments and things of that sort. So it's, everything in it, I think, is pretty reasonable. But I do think it's overspecified. It was written at a time where people wanted to put a lot more into the standard than needed to be. And in a number of areas, I recently had a meeting with a working group talking about electromagnetic compatibility requirements, the amount of interference that voting devices should be able to withstand or emit. And we came to the agreement that it doesn't make sense to specify all these requirements in the VVSG. Let's see what we can do about pointing elsewhere. And I think that's a good philosophy overall throughout the standard. If we can point someplace else, that's a good idea. Especially in the security area, but I know in other areas, requirements have to be living. You can't put requirements for penetration testing or for internet security in a document and still have it be nimble. You may have to respond to something fairly quickly. So that we can point to other guidance in those areas, I think would help things considerably.
Thank you. Let me just ask Sindhu and Joe, if there was one change you could make to the certification process, what might it be?
I think I'd like to see systems getting certified quicker, probably at least upgrades, like from an operating system perspective, or operating system upgrades or anything like that should be going quicker than what we have right now.
I think the one change I would make is that EAC reports and state reports of certification of systems would include the evidence, not just the report, but the actual test cases that were used and the like. I would bet close to less than one handful of people in this room have ever seen a single piece of test code for a voting system. So it's all probably quite marvelous. You probably wonder what it really looks like. And I can promise you it is quite marvelous in a strangely frightening fashion.
And with that,
Evidence.
let me open up things, and back in the back with Eddie, Chair. Yeah, let's get this on tape.
Thank you. I want to thank the whole panel.
I saw you nodding and waving your arms, Eddie. So
I did. I'm really heartened and, agree with 100% of what I've heard up there. So thank you to the whole panel. I want to tee off of comment, your question, John, and your answer, Joe, but my question is to the whole panel. We've talked about the standards themselves. You started alluding to different things in the testing process itself. Based on what each of you knows about how the accredited third-party voting system test laboratories operate today, my question is, what are your thoughts? What, if anything, would you like to see changed in terms of their capabilities or the transparency there, which you've alluded to? And the follow-on question is, and do you think it is adequate or not, if the standards are indeed raised in the way that you're hopeful for, will the higher standards in and of themselves drive the kind of testing that we want? Or as I said, what thoughts, if any, do you have about their actual capabilities and how they might need to change? Thanks.
Who would like to go first on that?
domain expertise.
So one of my jobs is to inspect the labs periodically to see if they meet certain standards for testing, laboratory assessment program. It's not so much how well are they testing voting systems, but are they set up properly to test? But of course, past performance comes into play. There are 2 labs right now. It would be nice if there were more. So that's one thing. People have brought up for quite a while that that some people would prefer that the EAC or some governing body select the lab for a particular test campaign as opposed to the manufacturer. So that's one area, but there's some issues with that, but that's one thing that could help a number of people feel easier about that selection process. In my own opinion, the labs are doing a good job of testing to VVSG 1.0. So that's the major issue. And under the, like if Joe and others would like to see more evidence, the current system works against that. So if a test lab says, we tested your system, it met all the requirements, but man, I don't want to use it. They can't say that because, they're not going to get any business, but even more so, it's just tough to do that, working with other industries where they're your customers and you're also issuing opinions. So a different process where people were more free to offer that sort of opinion would, I think, improve things a good deal.
I think I echo a lot of items that John mentioned, and I also feel that it would help states a lot if there was a possibility for the labs to share their test cases and exactly what was tested, because in many situations, we actually have opportunities to rely on the state-specific testing, and we don't want to repeat any testing that's being done, right? So if we had more insight into what the specific test cases are and how it was tested and how the lab came to the conclusion that it met the requirements, that would actually help state testing a lot.
Cindy, let me ask a follow-up question. I think last night when we were having a private discussion, did you not say that Pennsylvania's test cases and evidence are all public information? Is that correct?
So the test cases, the test report actually is public, and that actually specifies what was tested. And the test cases are also public. And we haven't been posting the recent ones up yet. That's because of the
Backlog.
yeah.
Thoughts, Joe? You always have thoughts.
So I've only interacted with one VSTL so far, and they're no longer around. So I don't have good experience here. I probed them around what kinds of systems they understood and were good at testing, which I think is wholly driven by lazily learning what they're forced to learn by virtue of what's being certified. And unfortunately, it was very reflective of like 80s and 90s technology, because I would ask questions like, do any vendors use X, Y, or Z? Do you have expertise in these things? And they would always say, no, but we're very interested in that if there's a business case. So on the one hand, I think if there's a business case, they'll do it. But that means that whomever uses new technologies will be the guinea pig and will probably pay the burden of that, because it's not clear to me that they will invest their own internal, either internal R&D or professional development to make sure their people can understand the system that's being certified. So that's a concern I hold, especially given some of the corner requirements in VVSG moving forward.
Could I just respond quickly? I think it's better today. The two labs are also testing other types of devices, that medical devices and gambling systems, and so I think they're better in that regard. I had some other brilliant thought, but it'll come back to me.
Tim? Where's
John?
I'm sorry, you had the mic, and then Kim Zetter.
All right, Doug Kellner from New York. And I'm also a member of the Standards Board, and I think I was just one of 4 people last year to vote against recommending the adoption of new guidelines 2.0. And my concern is that the guidelines are basically a compromise of the least common denominator. The guidelines do not require a voter verifiable paper ballot or audit trail. And so I was comfortable in voting against it, even though when you're 4 out of 110, that puts you in a pretty small minority. And I think the same thing happened in the technical guidelines TGDC, Development Committee. Where a couple of people who are part of EVN did speak out against it, but there was no coordinated outcry against the guidelines or a coordinated effort to identify what we as an election integrity community think is a shortfall in the guidelines. So I'm wondering what the panelists think about whether we should be supporting the guidelines as better than what we have now, or whether there should be a more coordinated effort to highlight what's missing from the guidelines.
Thoughts?
Let's see. With regard to the principles and guidelines not requiring paper records, maybe the microphone can make its way over to Gemma, who might comment on that. But
right there.
I don't. I hope you. Well, let's let Gemma go first.
Well, the other thing I would put in before Gemma gives us some feedback about that is that these are out for comment right now, and so there's nothing to prevent us, both as organizations and as individuals, to say, hey, these things are lacking, these things are too soft, and we have an email list, we have other ways of sort of.
Well, John, I like to feel like I'm part of a group.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Sending my own comments.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering if people think that this is important.
I think we should maybe talk about that over lunch. But Gemma, what?
Agreed. That's all I was going to say was the same thing, that that the principles and guidelines are out for public comment, and we're definitely looking forward to feedback from the community, hearing what folks think about the current state of them. I didn't have too much further. You kind of stole my answer, John.
The only thing I'll add is that I do think that having low-level technical requirements in a document that the commissioners have to approve is not working. Mm-hmm. And so there has to be some way to do it differently. And, there could be legislation that redoes HAVA completely and comes up with a more rational thing. But I tend to think that that's not so likely. And so this is an attempt to improve the situation. And it seems like a reasonable approach. I think things are going in the right direction. I would encourage you, though, if you have better ideas, everybody is going to take a look at. I believe everybody will consider all comments received.
And additionally, we do have Principle 9, which covers auditability and covers different aspects under. I think that was one of the points that you mentioned. But yeah, Principle 9 does cover auditability, and we have various guidelines under that section.
So is there a microphone that can be given to Kim?
While that's being handed over, I will just say we're not going to be shy about keeping our comments private. So, I imagine there's a subset of us in the room who will share a Google Doc that will mark up the principles and give joint feedback.
Right.
So you're talking about testing and certification, and I'm wondering what the process is, if at all, for decertification. So if the labs are certifying a system and everyone finds out, let's say Alex Halderman or anyone else looking at systems, finds serious problems with the systems, is there a process in place for pulling that system back and re-examining it? And secondly, Pennsylvania, which you're an anomaly, doing your own PES testing, if you find something in the systems that the labs overlooked, do you take that information back to the labs? Do they ask you for it? Does the EAC facilitate that? Does that get fed back into the process of further testing or decertification?
Yeah, so I think from a Pennsylvania standpoint, right, the election code actually allows the secretary to decertify systems if we find anything. From a testing standpoint, we always work collaboratively. If we ever find anything during the testing, we go back to the labs. And then one of the main things that we have been doing recently is we try to test in conjunction with the EAC testing rather than waiting for the EAC testing to complete. It was started because we needed to get the process moving, but that effectively actually helped us in a way, because if we find anything, then we can actually go back to the lab and the vendor and tell that this is a problem. So if there is a chance, can you fix it in this version? Otherwise, you'll have to wait for the next version to be certified in Pennsylvania. So that has helped a lot, just to make sure that the process is moving. So we actually wait till a point where the lab can say that they are pretty much firm that this is going to be the final trusted build that is going to be certified, and then we start on the testing at that point, because the EAC testing further has a lot of additional testing, like the regression, the accuracy, and all those. So that way, I think we can do that, and we have been doing that. And the vendors have been actually pretty much responsive to many of the comments from the examinations.
We've got a 5-minute warning, so I'm going to. Oh, I'm sorry.
There is a decertification process. My most honest answer is I knew what it was at one point, and I don't know. It's in the EAC's manuals online, and if we can talk later, I'll point you in the right direction.
At the federal level?
I don't think it has.
I don't think it has at the federal level, but I suggest in August we will have good occasion to try to use it.